So since we have quorum, we'll get started. First of all, I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who's here. Everyone who's participating in these meetings is either volunteering their time or taking time away from other pressing work. And so I just wanted to say out loud that I really appreciate everyone's participation, navigating work obligations and more. I know the board members, we all contribute different perspectives, but we have common goals here, really the well-being of all Californians. And I'm especially appreciative of the work DOJ has been doing on the report that we'll hear and be working on today, hear about today. So actually, let me take a moment to, I'll introduce myself. I'm Lily Kajabi. I'm a professor at Loyola Marymount University and an appointee of the Attorney General's office. And my pronouns are she, her, and I'd like to pass on to another board member. Board Member Diallo, would you care to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. My name is Souley Diallo. I'm an attorney in private practice here in Riverside, California. I formerly was a supervisor at the Riverside County Public Defender's Office for about 15 years. I am an appointee of the California Public Defenders Association, and I will pass that over to Board Member Dobard.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. John Dobard with Catalyst California and an appointee of Speaker Emeritus Anthony Rendon. I will pass it to Board Member Smith.
Good afternoon, Chauncey Smith, Catalyst California, an appointee of the Attorney General, Bonta. I will pass it to Board Member Alatorre.
Hey, Captain Jose Alatorre, CHP, representing the California Highway Patrol.
Great. Thank you. Are there any other board members who are here today who want to introduce themselves? And from DOJ, are there any others?
Andrea Guerrero.
Oh, thank you. Board Member Guerrero, can you hear me?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Andrea Guerrero, Alliance San Diego, and I'm an appointee of the Senate President Pro Tem.
Wonderful. Thank you, Board Member Guerrero. Are there any others who are here? So I apologize. I can now, the board members who've introduced themselves, I can see you now. It's great to see you all. I'm wondering if there are any others here to introduce themselves today. Garrett, are you able to weigh in?
Oh, I've counted 6. So
okay, that's us. Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So I believe that's it. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. I appreciate that. So our first piece of business is to approve or disapprove, I guess, the minutes from our last meeting, which was in March 17th. And so if I could ask board members to take a moment if they'd like to bring up those minutes, and in particular, if anyone wants to move that we approve them. Or, well, I guess a move to approve and then we'll vote.
I will move to approve the meeting minutes from our prior subcommittee meeting, which I believe was on March 17th, 2026.
That's right.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. So DOJ, may I ask you to do a roll call vote for us? Thank you. I'm sorry, I said DOJ, Garrett. Thank you.
Okay, what's fine. Member Alatorre.
Hey.
Member Diallo.
Aye.
Member Dobard.
Aye.
Member Guerrero.
Aye.
Member Kajabi.
Aye.
Member Smith.
Aye.
All right, that's 6-4. 6 in favor.
That's right.
So, yeah.
So it's unanimously.
Right, so I guess that's approved.
Thank you very much. So we're going to begin then, or move now to updates from the Department of Justice.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Kajavi. To begin on the topics of the update from the Department of Justice, we have a presentation from Research Services on the analysis of this year's STOP data. Then we will begin a review of the draft of the 2027 STOP data chapter. So I think, and following that, there is an agendized 5-minute break before the subcommittee reconvenes to discuss the STOP data draft. So that's what's going on. And so Research Services, are you available to begin the presentation when you're ready? So
yes, I'll go ahead and share my screen.
While that's coming up, also thank you, Garrett, for reminding us about the break, and please feel free at any time to remind us if there's something we've missed on the agenda. Thank you, I appreciate that.
Okay, I assume everyone can see my screen. My name is Dr. Eric Van Holm. I am the principal researcher on the RIPA portfolio here at Research Services in the DOJ. And today I'm going to give an overview of the STOP data section. We have begun analysis of the 2025 data, and as a baseline, I wanted to provide an overview. In 2025, we had nearly 5.5 million stops from 535 agencies. That's an increase of about 8% over 2024. And between 2023 and 2024, we saw an increase as well. And in 2024, where there was around 5 million stops. It's worth noting that CHP reported roughly 400,000 more stops in 2025 than 2024, which does account for a significant amount of that growth. But we're still trying to understand why the numbers are increasing. Today, this presentation will focus on the STOP data section and be largely an overview of the demographics that we collect as part of RIPA each year. As part of every stop, the officer reports their perception of the race, gender, sexual orientation, age, English fluency, disability, and housing status. And I'll try to emphasize here, all demographics collected are based upon perception data. When I discuss each demographic, I will try to reemphasize that this is based on perception, but I would like to avoid saying that word 100 times in the next 10 minutes, so I admit it at times. But all demographics are based on police perception. Collecting that allows us to understand who is being stopped and how those stops are proceeding. With our limited time today, I'll give an overview of all of those categories. And I'll also discuss a few outcomes and actions and things that occur during a stop. But because time is limited, I'll be focusing on race within that for the majority of the presentation. If there's anything specific that a board member would like to see in a future presentation or that has questions about, please raise that because we can make sure to include that in future presentations. In this initial slide, we observe the racial breakdown of stops in blue, paired against the statewide racial breakdown in orange. And so where the blue bar is higher than the orange, the share of stops for that group exceeds their share in the state. As such, Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Pacific Islander, and Middle Eastern, South Asian each are stopped at a rate that exceeds that, which would be based just on their demographics within the state. Alternatively, Asian, multiracial, and white individuals are stopped somewhat less than would be predicted. We now move to gender, where we see the vast majority of stops occur for those who are perceived to be cisgender males, almost 72%. 28% of stops, nearly 28% of stops are those perceived to be cisgender women, and less than 1% of all stops are of those perceived to be non-binary or transgender men or transgender women. Moving to age, less than 2% of all stops are of those below the age of 18. The most common age group in the data is those between 25 and 34, and the frequency declines over time into old age from that peak. Bless you. Thank you. Here we combine the 4 other demographics that we collected. What we observe is a strong majority-minority for each demographic, as there is only a small number of those stopped that are perceived to either be LGBT+, or having limited no English fluency, or having a disability, whether physical or mental, or are unhoused. Of note here, though, and this goes back to the point made about perception, roughly 9% of the state self-identifies as LGBT+, and in the stop data, only 1% of stops are of LGBT+. And so perception might play a particular role in that demographic, but across all the demographics in terms of how visually cueable different demographics are for individuals. And that goes into all the data that we have, which is an obvious limitation, but it's something that does come up. Moving forward from simply the demographics of the data, we can start to observe how stops initiate or end at different rates for different groups. We begin with the reason for stop, where the data is divided to show whether the stop occurs as the result of a traffic stop based on reasonable suspicion or something labeled as other, which includes it's a catch-all of things like truancy violation or a warrant. The vast majority of stops for all racial groups are traffic stops, but there are differences across groups. For those perceived as Middle Eastern or South Asian, more than 95% of stops are traffic related, while traffic composes less than 80% for Black and Native American. How a stop begins can often shape the interaction, so many of these differences will run throughout the data. Here we see the reason for stop broken down by gender. Cisgender individuals, whether women or men, and those perceived to be non-binary, are more likely to have their stops generated by traffic, than those that are transgender. Transgender individuals have close to 20 percentage points fewer traffic stops than the other groups. And like I said at the beginning, we won't run through each demographic for all of these slides, and so in the interest of time, we'll move to actions now. Moving from how a stop begins to actions taken during a stop, this graph shows the average actions taken during a stop broken down by race. In an average stop, an individual perceived to be Black will have 0.89 actions taken on average, which is the highest rate, followed by Native Americans who have 0.83 actions taken. Those perceived as Middle Eastern South Asian have the lowest rate at 0.19 actions per stop, followed closely by those perceived as Asian at 0.23. So when we consider all stops, we observe large differences, as the rate for Black is 4 times that of Middle Eastern South Asian. This second graph compares individuals by perceived race, looking at the average number of actions only for stops where there has been at least one action. Actions often co-occur, and when one occurs, another is more likely to be used in tandem. And so only looking at those stops where at least one action is taken changes the data. And here we observe smaller differences between races. There are still differences, but the magnitude decreases. So those perceived as Black still have the highest rate of average actions in stops where there's at least one, 2.83. But the magnitude of the difference is reduced to the groups like Asian and Middle Eastern, South Asian, which are still the lowest rates even in this consideration. This slide shows the average actions taken broken down by gender, both for all stops on the left, and in a minute I'll bring up only those stops where at least one action was taken. Similarly to race, we see that certain groups have a higher rate of actions when all stops are considered, as those perceived to be transgender, men or women, both have one action on average occur during a stop. Cisgender men, on the other hand, have 0.65 actions. When we look at that in tandem with only those stops where at least one action has been taken, cisgender men actually have the highest average with 2.79 actions on average. Transgender men and women are closer to cisgender women and non-binary individuals with 2.59 and 2.55 actions, respectively. And what this indicates is that a larger share of stops for transgender individuals feature an action, but that on average, a stop when an action occurs is not as markedly different. This graph looks at the average actions across the remaining demographics for all stops, but in the interest of time, we don't compare them to stops with at least one action. The shift in results is similar to gender and race with a reduction of the differences. But here we see that across all stops, those that are LGBT+, those with limited no English fluency, those with disability, and those that are unhoused have a higher number of average actions taken across. Disability and unhoused in particular 1.84 and 2.14 actions per stop on average, respectively. And we can kind of compare those back to the differences that we saw in race, the differences that we saw in gender, to note how marked the difference is in terms of the rate that actions occur in stops of the disabled and unhoused, and how that inflates the average across all stops. One area of interest expressed by board members this year has been differences in stops based on mode of transportation. And here we look at two things: whether stops with a call for service, whether stops with a call for service by mode of transportation, and whether stops are officer initiated based on mode of transportation, all broken down further by race. And so this first graph shows the percentage of stops that are generated, the mode of transportation in all stops that are a call for service for each race. So looking first at just the top line to sort of build the intuition, for Asian perceived individuals, in stops that were initiated by a call for service, roughly 22% were vehicular stops for Asians. 77.6% were stops where they were pedestrian when the call for service was made, and 0.6% were stops where the individual was on a bicycle. The bicycle is fairly rare across all groups, all 8 racial groups. Less than 1% of stops were on a bicycle. A larger share of call for service occur for drivers that are Asian, Hispanic, and Middle Eastern, South Asian. And the smallest share of calls for service for vehicles are for Black and Native Americans. We also look at those stops that are officer initiated and see by mode of transportation again how that breaks down. We observe here that the vast majority of stops that are officer initiated are vehicular in nature. However, while Black and Hispanics both have over 10% of their stops as pedestrians, when the stop is officer initiated, the figure for Middle Eastern and South Asian are below 3%. And so again, these same differences carry throughout the data. How does the stop end across races? 21% of stops result in arrest for Native Americans, the highest rate, followed by Blacks at 15%. Conversely, Native American and Blacks have the lowest rate of citation as a result of stop. At the other end of the distribution, over 60% of stops result in citation for those perceived to be Asian or Middle Eastern, South Asian. And so we notice that the groups with more vehicular stops result in more citation, a way that these different measures inform and predict each other. As a final 2 slides, we look at search. And here we look at the rates of consent searches by race and ethnicity. 3 types of search are displayed: consent-only search, consent plus other basis for search, and other discretionary basis for search. We can observe that Blacks are searched using other discretionary basis in over 5% of stops. That's the highest rate across all groups, followed by Native American at 3.1% and multiracial at 2.42%, so nearly double the rate. The highest rate of consent only is, or the highest rate of consent as the only basis is Hispanic Latinx at 1.59 and Black at 1.49. Consent-only searches with other bases occur in 1.4% of stops for those perceived to be multiracial. It's the highest rate, followed by 1.3% of stops for Blacks. How often do those searches lead to discovery? We see generally higher discovery rates for those perceived to be Native American, with the highest rate for consent only, with the highest rates for consent plus other basis and other discretionary basis, and the second highest rates for consent-only search. Pacific Islanders have the highest rate of discovery for consent-only searches, and white perceived individuals are generally above the mean as well for all 3 measures. At the other end of the distribution, despite being searched at high rates, Black perceived individuals have the lowest rate of discovery for consent-only searches and consent plus other basis. Hispanic Latinx also tend to be at the lower end of the distribution across all 3 measures. And so this has been a brief introduction to the data that we will be including in the stop data section. A lot of this is the same analyses that we've done in previous years, which helped to build out the report. But these are not the only work that we will be including in the stop data section or others. In the stop data section, we'll also be doing some longitudinal work to show how these trends have been shaped over the last 4 years, where we've had all agencies reporting to see whether we've seen increases or decreases in any of these measures. We'll also show that data will actually start to preview next week at the full board meeting. We'll also do a fuller public transportation analysis in this year's report, and we'll also be updating some data about immigration related stops that California agencies participate in interaction with other departments. In the policy section, I'll also mention that we'll be including an analysis on the interaction of race and language fluency as a factor that can change how actions or outcomes occur in stops, and how those two might have an interaction and additive effect for individuals who are stopped. And we'll also be building in a longitudinal component to that. And in addition, we'll be analyzing a number of policies that local agencies and the state have passed in the last decade, which may have changed policing outcomes. And so thank you for the opportunity, and I'll take any questions. And if there's anything I can clarify, please let me know.
Thank you so much, Eric. Can I ask if there are board members who would, oh, and Eric, can you keep the slides handy? I know you.
Sure.
Yeah. There, if you want to post them, great. So although we'll move on later in the meeting to talking about the draft as well, I'm opening it up to their board members who had comments, questions about the presentation that we just heard. And I'm not sure if I'll see if folks raise their hand. I do see that board member Guerrero has. If anyone else has raised a hand and then you think I'm not seeing it, please just holler. Board member Guerrero, can I invite you to begin? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Eric, for the presentation.
Of course.
I am wondering if you could provide clarity to us, and then also I think the report warrants some clarity around the way you're presenting data in the report. So there's like usually it's a percentage, comma, and then number of stops. And so what's not clear to me is if, for example, 5%, comma, 500 stops, if 5% is of 500 stops, or if 5% equals 500 stops.
Right. Well, and so, I mean, if you're pulling out 5% because of this graph and
I'm not referencing this graph. I'm just using as an example.
Yeah. And generally it'll depend on the measure, but generally we mean 5% of 500 stops.
Okay, then because you use this, or I'm not sure if you are the author of the report or you're just doing the data tables, but this representation of data is throughout the data stop data section of the report. And so if I can point to a specific page if that's helpful. So for example, on page 14, just happens to be the page I'm on, which is on consent inquiries. And it says that officers asked for consent search to stop individuals perceived to be transgender men, boys, is 5.29%, comma, 518 stops. So it's not clear in the report, and then I'm toggling between the report and your data tables, whether 5.29% is of 518 stops of transgender men, boys, or if 5.29% equals 518 stops. And I could try to figure that out by looking at your graphs and doing some math, but I think it warrants clarification.
Okay, definitely. And we will make sure to clarify that as the report moves forward. That's a really good point.
So can we, just to emphasize this point, thank you so much for raising that. And maybe we'll come back to this when we look at the draft as well. more closely, but from the very get-go in the draft on, let's see, page 3 is where the first tallies are for all of 2025. And so based on the slide, the total number of stops we see was around 5.5 million. And then I see that most of those are officer initiated, and that is at the very top of page 3. It says 92% were officer initiated, 7% call for service. And the numbers after those indicate that this is what Board Member Gotto, I think, is getting at. The percent is out of a total, and then the N is the count within that category, rather than a reader might read it and think, oh, it's, if it says like 90% of something, then a number, then you think, oh, I have to take 90% of the number. I actually, maybe the convention that's chosen here is actually fine to have a percent, and then the N that's within that tally, but it has to be just crystal clear to all of us, to anyone reading the report, that that's what's there. And so we're not necessarily saying to change all the N's, but to make it loud and clear what the N is counting, if I understood that correctly. I see some folks nodding, so I think about that. And maybe when we come back to the report, we could reiterate that. But and I know that you appreciate the slides. I know that the slides don't include the N's as well, the tallies, since this is just to give us a window in. But thank you so much for that, Board Member Guerrero. Were there other slide comments that you wanted to, or questions, or other to add? No. And also, can I open up? Are there other board members who had any questions? And I actually have a question about the very slide that's up. But are there? Maybe I'll just jump in and then invite other board members to jump in. So obviously something that's jumping out from this slide loud and clear is that, in particular for Black individuals who are stopped, there's a highly disproportionate, that is this other discretionary basis for search. And I wanted to ask, first of all, if other basis or other discretionary basis, it says, includes parole or probation status. I'm assuming it does. But then so I wanted to highlight, I think in the report, it comes out that, for example, Black drivers are asked if they're on parole, asked about their status much more than any other racial or ethnic group. And so I guess I'm sort of want to plant in the ear of board members as well, or in the mind, that this is something I would like us to look at, are discretionary searches, and are they disproportionately impacting, in particular here, Black drivers, but any particular other racial and ethnic groups. Because a companion to this, I think on the next slide, can you forward one more slide too, Eric?
The discovery rate?
Yeah, exactly. And then what we see is we have a group of people in particular here, Black, mostly drivers, so I'll just say Black drivers, I know it can be pedestrians too, but being asked about probably parole status more often than other groups, and then being subject to a search probably on the basis of that, but in fact the discovery rates are lower, or disproportionately lower for that group than the others. And so so this isn't a correction or comment about the slides, it's an observation I wanted to share while we have the slides in front of us. As we're thinking about recommendations, just as a board, we've looked at the issue of consent and where officers have discretion in trying to tease out if there are different racial ethnic groups who are disproportionately impacted by that. Board Member Guerrero, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was thinking something similar. I was about to ask one, if we could footnote other discretionary basis for search, because I think understanding what all of the criteria for searches are and which ones are discretionary versus any that are non-discretionary. Would there be non-discretionary searches that we would identify, and what would they be? And then to your point, Lily, the issue of are you on probation or parole? it would be really important to see a graph dedicated to that intersection because, for example, we're looking at consent plus other bases for search. It would be really interesting to see that like specifically consent plus probation parole inquiry. Because we know we've looked for a couple of years at the consent only searches. We have a lot of concerns about that and their disproportionate impact on Black and Brown Californians, especially when we look at that cut by age. And we have looked at the cut by age before, like especially for youth, and it would be great to see a continuation of that analysis by, do another cut of this by age, but then to really draw out the intersection of consent plus probation parole inquiries.
Thank you. Eric, you don't have to respond on the fly, but is being raised. Are there any questions or comments or clarifications that you'd like to or ask about? Just I don't know if it's clear with this sort of this intersection between the policy where officers have discretion to search and then the on the ground, if you will, impact, and teasing out in particular what constitutes other discretionary basis, and then how does that intersecting with, as was raised, for example, the consent search practices.
Yeah, and search is always of interest to the board, and so we wanted to make sure we mentioned it today. But that's something that we could tease out, if not at the full board meeting, then at the next stop data committee, and devote more time to search, both breaking down the different types and how the outcomes differ across those types.
Yeah. And if I could get on the soapbox again, I mean, you said search, and we all know that the search really changes the tenor of a traffic stop. And also for law enforcement officers, it's going to change the time spent on a stop and so on. And so removing unproductive searches is valuable in many, many humanizing ways. Okay, so in particular, what are the bases for a search? Are there areas where officers have discretion? And in particular, is there some there's sort of the intersection of these bases? And in particular, in my mind, can we tease out searches that are, well, for lack of a better word, just unproductive? Board Member Guerrero?
Yeah, I don't recall if we saw a graph on this, but it is something we've looked at before. Looking at all of the bases for a search and the discovery rates for each of those bases. I don't recall if we saw that already. No. Okay. So it would be great to see that, because I think that gets at the board's longstanding concern that consent searches are the least effective way to discover or consent only searches, I should say, when you isolate consent. And so that deepens the inquiry about the value of a consent only search that is a search that is not based on probable cause, which we have recommended be the basis for any search. And I'll just add that there are a couple of places here where you combine like a conversation around Terry frisk and searches, and I think that it would be better to disaggregate those because of this issue of consent searches, which don't have any basis that are articulated, and Terry frisks are based on reasonable suspicion, right? So those are two fundamentally different things. And I think when you conflate a suspicion-based frisk with searches that are a combination of things with bases and things with not, It's just not helpful to fuse them. It would be better to separate them.
I appreciate that. That sounds like a comment that's especially to the draft. And so maybe we can, I invite you to reiterate that.
Fair.
Again, when we go to the draft, I really appreciate its comments. Since we have the slides here and Eric thank you, Eric, at our disposal, are there other, anything other board members want to highlight or mention, especially in light of the overview we just got, including the slides? And Eric, while you've got the slides, do you want to go to that? May I ask you to go to the last slide also? That's just listing, where things are heading.
These future things, yes.
Thank you. I don't know if that's helpful to any other board members to focus on. So I don't see other board members indicating you want to speak. I do have a question, just a quick question, maybe it's to DOJ or to law enforcement related to parole and probation status. Are there agencies where if an officer finds that someone, let's say they're on probation, is required to search, or is it discretionary? Or I'm assuming, I think that it's discretionary here. I think it's put under other discretionary basis for search, but if I'm wrong, I'd love someone to correct me, or maybe to say it varies.
Yeah, it varies by each individual agency's policies and what their protocols are. Just because somebody's on parole or probation doesn't always dictate that you are going to search them, and then you have to verify their search terms and get that before anything is conducted. And then again, you don't have to if you don't have some reason that you know, some kind of reasonable suspicion thinking, hey, there is something going on in this car.
Thank you. That's really helpful for me to understand more. So from a layperson's perspective, it sounds like if someone's on probation, and an officer has that information, it might give them additional, like a legal basis to search, but that doesn't mean that they have to. And then within each agency, there might be different, I don't know, officers might be advised in different ways. And I heard you also say reasonable suspicion. So if someone had reasonable suspicion anyway, then they could conduct the search, but this is like an additional legal basis. But
correct.
But absent that, then they wouldn't have to search.
Yeah,
Sorry.
correct. And then we verify, the conditions of their search parameters before we conduct anything as well. Just to verify that, because there's a lot of people that, that they don't know, if they're on probation or not, or on parole. And then, we definitely want to verify that information before we do anything further.
Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. That's very helpful. Are there any other comments? So in this portion of the meeting, we're focused especially on the presentation and the slides. So I'm just going to open up my copy of the agenda just so it's handy. But can I ask, are there other board members who wanted to add anything additional? Okay, so I think, and then we'll move to other parts of the meeting. I'll just say also, you can see, you don't have to keep up the slide, but you'll see there's a lot of interaction as usual between the policy section and then the RIPA data. And I know many of the board members here may also be on the policies subcommittee. So I appreciate that overlap. And maybe that means that the next, I don't remember, I guess our next meeting is a full board. And so then everyone has access to all of the drafts. And I just wanted to say I'm really looking forward to the new iterations of the policy draft this year too. Just so much overlap. I was looking back at our notes from our last subcommittee meeting, and a lot of the discussion we had is around topics that are really now going to be in the policies section. So Garrett, you had reminded me that there is a break scheduled.
Well, actually,
did you want us to have that at this point or at the time that the break would have arisen if we were?
So I actually, sorry, as part of the DOJ update, I was also going to discuss.
Oh, I'm
the
sorry.
Draft.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So
Perfect.
that's fine. And we've already been kind of discussing the draft, so that's fine. But I was going to go discuss the draft a little bit, and then we can have the break. My expectation is then we would have the break, and then we would continue to discuss, and then the other aspects of the meeting, like public comment. So that was so if that sounds good, I'll go through. We could do the break now, but I think it's agendized for 2, so I think we should probably just have it then. But
please go ahead.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. So I would like to turn the subcommittee's attention to the stop data draft, which we've already been discussing, and I'm happy to answer questions during the presentation, and I'll also be available in the next hour to discuss as well. So as you've seen, we're kind of using this is a draft, but we have pretty much the same format we used last year for the kind of basic data disclosures, and as we discussed, there might be some additional longitudinal features as well that aren't in here. And then another thing that remind you is that we don't have the charts, the graphics, all that isn't the kind of the final thing. So what was in the presentation isn't the final charts and what we expect to put in the draft. So you'll see that in the stop data section it says chart forthcoming. One thing also to note here is that we have been doing these breakout boxes in the draft. So you might see like a breakout box. There might be something that says like, what the first breakout box here is 2, which is like key terms, call for service, officer initiate. That's the kind of the help readers kind of like orient important terms, or something that you might get lost, or you might want to turn back to. Or in other cases we've had, we've included things that are kind of notable outliers, things like that, as like a breakout. So because there's a lot of information in this part of the document, we've used these breakout boxes to draw the reader's attention to something. And so one thing to consider is what kind of information do we want to have in these breakout boxes? Is the direction that we've been doing good, or is there specific items you think that might be more appropriate to have in the breakout box? That's something to consider. As the draft moves forward, is we can have different information in breakout boxes. Do we need to have more definitions to orient the reader, or are there specific kind of factoids that are kind of that more warrant a highlighting as someone's reading this document? So anyway, just going through this part of the report real quickly, pages 1 to 27, you'll see that we organize it the way we had in the past, where we begin with the discussion about the areas of the report of what initiates the stop, modes of transportation, the reason for the stop, actions taken during the stop, results of the stops, and then we move to and we've kind of discussed the definitions there, and then we move to the kind of demographic areas, demographic category by demographic category of the analysis. So perceived race and ethnicity, perceived gender, perceived age, perceived disability status, perceived English fluency, perceived sexual orientation, and perceived housing status. So that we go through that there, and I'll also make the same caveat as Eric, is that I'm going to leave that as maybe the last time I say perceived for a little bit. So, so that is the kind of pages 1 to 27. And so now I'd like to kind of move to down to page 30, if you're looking at what was distributed most recently. And we have some discussion on immigration enforcement as part of the additional stop data analyses. So as we've previously discussed, Research Services conducted a preliminary analysis of the 2022, 2023, and 2024 data. And they did looking at that and the analysis of the narrative fields from 2018 to 2024, they found some officers reported contacting California Border Protection in the narrative field, about 2,000 of those, and about 2,000 where the officer reported contacting TSA in the narrative field. In many instances, the officers described conducting detentions or issuing DOI violations at a border crossing in these narrative fields, and that was kind of the most common reasons, characteristic of these kind of contacts. In other instances, officers reported CBP contacted the LEOs, law enforcement officers, for assistance. The CHP, San Francisco Police Department, and the Los Angeles World Airport Police Department were the law enforcement agencies most frequently reported being involved with the Border Patrol in the narrative builds. So when we were reviewing these, we found that the analysis of the narrative builds could be very difficult. For example, the officers would use the term ICE, and it would not always relate to immigration and customs enforcement. It might be related to road conditions. It might be related to something in a beverage or ice cream, so an ice cream truck, all sorts of things. So that made it kind of difficult for us to narrow down using these narrative fields. So I think when we looked at that, we only found 33 stops that reported involvement with immigration and customs enforcement in that whole range. And typically that was an officer pursuing a warrant or conducting a warrant check. I think that we, for this memo going forward and what we're going to have in the section going forward, we're going to be focusing on the use of the contact DHS as the or looking at the non-primary agency method. So we're not going to be relying as much as on the narrative review, just because if the difficulties of extracting good information, and then also kind of the paucity of the kind of the most important salient features in that data from our review previously. So we will be that's still kind of in process, but yeah, that's where we are with that. And you'll see that what I've drafted here, or as the team has drafted here, is it begins with a discussion on the context for immigration enforcement related stop data. As noted in the draft, immigration enforcement related environment in 2025 may be different than the 2024 environment, and that's been a cause for concern. So we've tried to capture and respond to the concerns in this report. If there's additional information that the subcommittee or the board would like to include here, that would be welcome. Particularly why these events are concerning to the board might be something that would be maybe more express about. Also, if there are things that we want to highlight from the meeting we had, like on October 9th, that could also be something that you can provide us the discussions from that. So starting here, begins here, like during the period covered by this report, the frequency and character of immigration enforcement activity in California substantially increased. And so we discussed here that, about the meetings we've had and about the concerns the board's had with the kind of immigration enforcement nexus with stops. This draft also has a brief discussion relating to the laws surrounding state and local involvement in immigration enforcement. That discussion is in pages 28 to 29 of the draft. Different agencies may be behaving differently. Kind of the summary is that different agencies may be behaving differently, and we're trying to kind of capture room for that here in the discussion. We also have a discussion on the nexus of RIPA, racial profiling generally, and immigration enforcement on page 29. So just to kind of, when RIPA was passed, the legislature found that the profiling alienates people from law enforcement and erodes trust among the people served. And the kind of research on the impact of immigration, of kind of law enforcement and immigration involvement, is that there may be some kind of parallels there as well. So that might be something maybe to draw a lot more on. And then, yeah, so then we'll also be discussing, and maybe I jumped around here a little bit, sorry, is on page 29, we then discuss kind of the data we've been collecting on immigration involvement in RIPA. And then, so moving on ahead to our expanded transportation analysis. So there's been some interest in understanding how transit stops differ from pedestrian stops, because those are kind of collapsed in the data set. But I think the subcommittee and the public have expressed that maybe there'd be an interest in trying to understand what's what's pedestrian and what's happening in what's people walking on satellites or people outside, and what's happening inside buses, happening inside trains, and also the areas going in and out of those. So first report, we'll begin with a background on previous analysis of transportation. And then the report moves, and that's on page 30. And then the report moves to a discussion of policing and transit on pages 30 to 32 of the draft. And I could definitely appreciate feedback from the subcommittee here to make sure that we're considering the best set of information and asking the right questions. We've included some Center for Policing Equity's report on BART fare enforcement, a study on Los Angeles trains from 2022. And then we've also included some information from LA County Metro as context here. So we start by noting that policing in public transit may differ substantially from policing on roadways or in other public spaces. And in particular, noting with the transit that there's all policing in these public places, it's kind of more of keeping order type policing. And there has been some study analysis that points to this type of policing being a source of disproportionate policing. As noted in this draft, we've included a study that's noted in the BART study there. We've also tried to capture the perspective of the transportation agencies. On page 31 to 32, we've included some citations and discussion from LA Metro about their use of kind of fair evasion enforcement and how that relates to maybe more broadly their public safety initiatives. So we're trying to capture a better understanding of how these different pieces fit together. And so, this is kind of like a backbone or a beginning of trying to understand how these policies may be a source of disproportionate policing, but also maybe why the kind of keeping order type policing might have a legitimate use for a transit agency. Trying to understand that, and then if the committee has other areas that we should be looking at in this, other angles, other perspectives, that would be helpful and welcome here. Particularly, I think one issue is that this is BART and Los Angeles, and it doesn't really give us perspective on rural or exurban California public transportation. So it's kind of really focused the sources here that we've included it's BART and LA Metro, basically. So we are in the process of developing the preliminary analysis on this issue, the data, and I don't have that to share with you. But I'll just say that we're kind of focusing on particular code sections that are highly identified with public transportation, do the analysis and the breakdown. And then finally, just to kind of, and this was already presented by Eric, but we're looking at a mode of travel analysis and officer initiated versus calls for service by mode of travel. That's on page 32. And so there does seem to be differences between groups of people and how often a traffic or bike stop is stopped as a call for service or how often is officer initiated. And so maybe looking at this and looking at that graph, maybe there's more information we could draw out here. It does seem to be that there is differences, even if we assume like even if we assume that like there's a difference in how these groups are using transportation, we know that, but there also seems to be even considering that to be differences in how often the groups are differentially subject to different kinds of stops based on their transportation choice. So we're going into it's like right now it's 2 p.m. So I could take questions now. We could do the 5-minute break, and I guess I can also whatever the reference is from the subcommittee. But if you want to ask me some questions now, that's fine.
Thank you, Garrett. So we will have additional discussion of the draft after the break, but Garrett's opened the door to questions while we're all gathered at this moment. Does anyone want to, does anyone have questions or something they'd like us to start with before the break? Maybe I shouldn't have put it that way in case if It's not questions versus the break. We'll have the break regardless. We'll have questions regardless. But are there any questions for Garrett? Right. Well, I suspect we will have more discussion, and Garrett, well, of course, we'll have you back after the break. Is that?
Yeah. No. Actually,
Okay.
I have some reminders maybe to kind of start, if you want, of like things I asked or discussed or whatever. But
okay.
But obviously, you have your you'll all have 5 minutes to think about the questions or the topics to discuss.
Okay, great. So we'll come. So well, then I'll say, why don't we go ahead and take our 5-minute break? And so, well, I see that my clock, I think, just turned 1:59. But why don't we say we'll start at 5 after sharp? So that's a 6-minute break. Whew, if that's okay, everyone. All right. I will see you soon. Thank you. Okay, we're aiming to reconvene after our break. As soon as we hit quorum, we will.
And just to remind members of the subcommittee, please turn on your cameras so we can reestablish quorum.
Okay, I think that we're good to start. Thank you, everyone. Garrett, thank you very much for that presentation, for talking us through the draft. It sounded like more of the sort of questions or updates are centered more around the last half of the draft. And so even though I'd like us to look at all the sections, I'm wondering if it actually makes sense to start in the later part. Let me see if I can be more specific, but meaning that the first part of the draft, let's see, let me get back into it, includes maybe more descriptive data and graphs that'll be coming in. But Garrett, there were sections where you were outlining in particular, I think you were interested in maybe it's the additional stop analyses from page 27 on.
Yeah, I mean, so if there's an additional important context to add to the discussion of immigration stops or transportation topics, that would be important to the subcommittee. I mean, we don't have all the final data product yet, but you know, as we're developing it and orienting the discussion that's in the draft with these hopefully insightful analyses, the context to help build us the understanding there. And then also, but even going back to the previous sections, if there's, you know, as I discussed, there's like the breakout boxes, but I see member Smith has his hand raised, so.
All right, so yeah, why don't we start, board member Smith, we'll start wherever you'd like to, and then if we start in a later part, we'll be sure to circle back to Garrett. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Garrett. I appreciate the presentation and your research and writing for producing the report. I think this initial draft looks great. So appreciate your hard work. I have one thought when it comes to the portion of the report about transportation analysis. So on pages 30 and pages 31, you have a piece there about fair enforcement within the context of the transportation analysis. And it talks about how fair enforcement is racially disparate. It disproportionately falls on Black and Latinx people. And it also talks about the ineffectiveness of fair enforcement, which shows that when the searches occur during the stops for fair enforcement, compared to non-fair enforcement stops, the rate of contraband or discovery is lower, right? Which shows that it's a questionable practice in terms of improving safety on public transportation. And I'll add that in working with some local partners on this issue that have been really trying to make sure that safety and equity is improved on public transportation. Another compelling argument and idea that they often point out is talking about the purpose of fair enforcement and talking about how it's often used by localities or local transportation agencies as a revenue generation scheme, as opposed to a means of actually improving safety. Because as you point out in your research, the effectiveness of the practice is questionable if you consider discovery rates as a measure for effectiveness during these sorts of encounters. So I think it would also be helpful to add a little bit of context to unpack that underlying rationale for fair enforcement as a means of revenue generation. For example, in LA Metro, I believe in some prior years, maybe regularly, they account for this stream of revenue in budgeting for the future, budgeting for the future year out, right? Like how much revenue is generated through fair enforcement. And I think that the fact that local transportation agencies are going about law enforcement as a means of revenue generation or budgeting based on discriminatory practices is extremely problematic, and it's something that we could potentially uplift. So I just want to offer that up as a suggestion to add on to the already great work that you've provided here. And I'll pause there.
Thank you so much for starting us off and for those comments. I think I heard, I heard many strands in that, but two separate strands. One is that there's this discussion about enforcement around fares and that it could be enriched even further with the references to how, to what extent is that actually a revenue generating model instead of a, public safety model. And then I heard separately that when, I don't know, a citation or something around fares is combined with search practice, that those searches are less productive, less likely to lead to a discovery. And so I heard the potential for a second recommendation there. So there's a recommendation of what can be in the report, but also in terms of policy recommendations, that this could be another area where there are searches that are highly discretionary, that have a disproportionate impact, especially on Black and brown riders, and aren't as productive as other searches. Is that, Chauncey, is it fair to say that those were two among the points you made? So the
Yes,
search
that's
one
correct.
Okay, great.
And I'll add that in budgeting off in developing the budget off of enforcement of fare evasion, it's not only problematic from more of a legitimacy standpoint, right? It's problematic just in terms of like public policy, the fact that you're budgeting based on discrimination, right? Like it doesn't sound so great, and it's actually harmful. But in addition to that, I've also seen research which shows that the cost of carrying out the stops to do the fare enforcement often exceeds the amount that's generated in return. So it's not only like problematic from a legitimacy standpoint, but it's also it doesn't actually fulfill its purported purpose, right? Which further places it on question. And I'll try to look into the stuff that I've seen in the past and share it with you, but I'm just recalling off the top of my head.
Thank you so much. Excellent. Are there, Garrett, I saw you nodding, so it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
One thing also
points were taken in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. And also just kind of one idea there too is just what are like maybe are there better models for fair enforcement, things like that too, and if different or I guess anything related to that and is there better and then maybe we could actually look at the impact of those different policies in California if we know of different methods or different philosophies.
Yeah, thank you for that Garrett. So the direction some of our partners have been going is to eliminate enforcement for fare evasion as a policy goal. And that happened a little bit during COVID. It happened when there was a fiscal exceptional circumstances. There were changes in policy temporarily during COVID, and they stopped doing fare evasion enforcement because a lot of people couldn't make ends meet, they couldn't pay, and they need to get around, and so there's examples out there of smart solutions, right? Because if someone can't pay to get on a train, it's often because of economic inequities, right? They just can't afford. They're struggling to make ends meet. They're obviously riding public transportation as opposed to like riding Mercedes Benz, right? And if they can't pay to hop on the train, it's most likely not because they're trying to steal from the local government. It's because they just can't afford it, right? But yeah, I think like the main takeaway here is I think we could unpack this a little bit more and add a little bit more to it, because I think it's an extremely important point, and I think there's a strong argument to be made that we could make a recommendation to eliminate fare evasion enforcement. And then on top of that, I've also seen research which shows that when you have more riders on public transportation, it creates more safety, right? So if you have a barrier to entry, like the cost of riding, it decreases the amount of people that can be on public transportation. It decreases the amount of eyes, the amount of community members and bystanders that can be there to help decrease the likelihood or deter people from engaging in, whatever may be going on that folks are concerned about too. So there's a lot of stuff we can to say on this piece. So thank you for getting it started.
Excellent, thank you. Are there other board members who'd like to make comments about any section of the draft, but maybe in particular, first about these later sections? So in particular, it could be around transportation, but also we have now this section growing related to immigration enforcement. This is a strong board interest as this section is taking shape. Even though we know there's sort of data to the extent that there's some counts available forthcoming. Board Member Guerrero, did you want to see your hand up? Go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks. You asked me to reiterate some of the things that I mentioned before that were relevant to the report, so I'll just tick those off quickly. That I'm suggesting that we include a discussion of consent intersecting with inquiries around parole and probation, that we include an analysis of that with age, so we can continue the conversation that we started in years prior. I think those were the main things that I wanted to say about. I wanted to reiterate. Oh, and then to disaggregate Terry frisks and searches, because that is lumping apples and oranges together, and we need to that does more harm than good in our conversations. In addition to those things that I've already mentioned around use of force, the data that is described in the narrative of the report around use of force with regard to youth is troubling. We've said it before, and when we focused on youth in years past, that the disproportionate effect of enforcement on youth is notable here. 1 in 5 youth are subject to use of force, and I think we need to understand that as it intersects with race. So it would be good to include an analysis of that 1 in 5, among that 1 in 5 youth, how does that break down by perceived race? And that discussion starts at page 16. And then I have a set of suggestions around the immigration section that you're describing. I appreciate that that's going to be developed. And I would suggest that as part of the report, the DOJ includes a list of the joint task forces that are reportable under the California Values Act. And if that list is too long, maybe some sort of summary and name the number and maybe a heat map of where those JTFs are operating in the state would be very helpful. So, and I'll drop into the chat if for context. Just a summary of what the California Act requires, Values Act requires, but it requires 3 things. One, the disclosure of participation in joint task forces involving federal agencies to the California DOJ. The public would benefit from knowing what those JTFs are, where they operate in the state. 2, the Values Act requires reporting to the California DOJ of the arrests made by joint task forces for immigration purposes. So you have that data, although it is shared out in various forums. It would be helpful here, since we're focusing on this, to put that in, especially since we are capturing data of referrals to DHS by law enforcement in the RIPA data. And in years past, when our organization has compared the RIPA reported referrals and the arrests made by JTFs, although referral and arrest is not the same thing, the discrepancy between those 2 numbers has been notable, and it's something we have used to drill down at the agency level to push for accountability and honesty and integrity and disclosure by the agencies. And then the third data point that is required under the California Values Act is transfer data. So any transfer by a California LEA to DHS. And, that may be with warrant, should be with warrant, but that sometimes happens without warrants. So those 3 data points, I think, are good context for understanding our own data that we're disclosing, and also socializing with the California public the role of the interaction between law enforcement in California and JTFs.
Excellent, thank you. Garrett, do you or others from DOJ have any questions or comments regarding those while we're all here? Or did I think I saw you taking this in, and I know there's a process after the meeting, but.
Yeah, I mean, unless someone else knows better than I who's on the call, but this will be the start of a request, I think.
Okay.
So I'm not able to.
That's fine. No, I just
provide more information on that.
But if there are questions as we're raising ideas as a board, let's pipe up. Other board members who wanted to add to this? Thank you, board member. Maybe I'm going to grab the floor and add a few more. First of all, let's see, we were talking in particular about the section on immigration, a very minor comment. I really appreciated that there was also reference to the board member meeting from last October. So that's part of the sort of the record of this meeting, that it appears here in this report as well. And I was really struck during that meeting by the, among other things, the takeaway of the duty to intervene. And I know that in our report, this isn't a report just about that meeting, and I know there's a footnote that can lead readers to more details about that meeting, but I was wondering if it would be appropriate to include a reference there or some kind of comment about duty to intervene, just to, this is yet one more place where that can be amplified. That's a very minor comment compared to all of the, I appreciate all the additions that could be made around joint task force and including concrete data. I was really struck by the suggestion of a heat map to show where the task force are operating. And I was wondering, Board Member Guerra, if I could swing back to you, if that's something that exists elsewhere or that just was a vivid idea. I think that's a great idea. So I guess I want to emphasize if it's possible for us to find out more about locations. That would be a great way to render that information beyond a list. Let's see. I wanted to circle back to maybe even in the very beginning of the report, the number of stops this year. This came up during the slide presentation, is more than 8% higher than last year. And I think, Eric, I heard you say that that's largely a CHP count change. I'm not sure if I heard that correctly or not. And so whether we can resolve that now or not, I guess I wanted to say that's a big enough change in number of stops being reported out in the draft. So to the draft, there's a comment that some agencies might fail to report. And I guess I wanted to know, what happens then if an agency doesn't report in RIPA data, or is that really happening in any appreciable way? I mean, I'm assuming that it's not. Maybe that's not a comment about the report, but just a question for us and for DOJ. What happens if an agency doesn't report, A, and B, if it was largely a change in CHP counts, then I think that could be noted in the report, if I heard that correctly. I don't know if there's anyone from DOJ who can respond now. Like, is it typical that there's some agencies that aren't reporting in RIPA data?
So I'm not really involved in that layer of the process. And if someone else from DOJ wants to jump in, that's fine. But I'm not sure if someone is from that layer is on this call.
So maybe this is a request not for the literal report, but just in general, if can we find out if there are agencies that are not reporting in data? I'm assuming that's not the case. And if that were the case, what happens? Do they report late? What, does it get included later, or what happens if there's a consequence?
Hi,
yes.
Daniel Harmon from the Research Services. We can absolutely talk about agencies that don't report. Some don't for a variety of reasons, like they didn't have a stop, like a college campuses might not have a stop. But we can speak to the potential reasons why that happens and identify agencies that do not have a listed reported RIPA data stop in our database.
Because I think if it's something besides an agency that has 0 stops, that you wouldn't expect a large number, if there are actually agencies for some reason not complying with reporting in, then it'd be important for us to know. Eric, I saw you unmuted too. Were you going to add to that?
Yeah, so I believe that there are 5 agencies that we didn't get data from, and that was for a variety of reasons. And we can, in a future meeting, have that list for you. I think one of the agencies refused to report. I think another couple had like technical issues. And so, but those are generally smaller agencies, and so it doesn't affect the overall counts that we report in the same way. And so, but every year there's agencies that have 0 stops, and they indicate that, and there's nothing to report then. And so, last year we had 535 agencies. I think we had 533 last year, 535 this year. The numbers fluctuate year to year. So, and that's just a normal part of the data collection.
So if an agency doesn't report because there were 0 stops, okay. If an agency is having technical issues, then we need to know and find out how to support that. And if an agency is just not reporting, that's a problem. So, okay, thank you for that perspective. I had one general comment about the draft, and I know this is just a draft. through the first many pages, it's the march of tallies and percents, and I'm assuming that there's some graphs, just as we've had in previous years, that would accompany that, because it's really much easier for folks to absorb all the number crunching that's been done with graphs. But I just wanted to say that out loud. So there's the many bar graphs that appear, even though it makes the report long, it makes it much more digestible. I want to circle back to the comment that Board Member Guerrero highlighted at the very beginning of the meeting, that when there's a percent and then a tally, it needs to be clear to the reader what the tally is, what the tally is, and maybe that happens in the introduction when those first tallies are presented. I don't know what the best fix is. I don't think the request was to go back and change them all to the totals, a percent of a total, I think, but just so that we know how to read the ends. And I had one more comment about clarity when I was looking at the last section about the section on calls for service versus officer initiated stops. I think in the past, folks from law enforcement have requested this breakout, sometimes because the distribution of those stops can look different. So suppose that, I don't know, suppose it looks like Black drivers are being stopped disproportionately, but in fact, those were attributed to calls for service, as opposed to officer stops where the officers had discretion. Then that's useful for law enforcement to know, even that that's not exactly the case. But anyway, there was a reason to tease those, separate them. And I think the way they've been separated here, it's not always clear what the takeaway is. And I'll give a more concrete example. Let me just see. If I say we look at mode of transportation, which is near the end or later part of the report, mode of transportation and officer initiated versus call for service stops. And let me try to find a page number. I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. Let's see. Page 33 would be an example. All right, I'm at that page too. I don't know if others want to look on, but what I realized was that I was reading where it says that some groups were stopped less frequently, or some groups were stopped more frequently. It felt like it might be easy to misread some of it. For example, on bicycle stops, the last sentence, or second to last, or last sentence says officer-initiated stops are officer-initiated stops most frequently in stops of individuals they perceived as Pacific Islander. And it makes it sound like the largest group, the greatest number of people who were stopped were Pacific Islanders, when in fact far more stops happen of Black cyclists. And so I think it's a question of wording it so that we're distinguishing basis of stop within race and ethnicity versus basis of stop overall groups. And the way it was worded here became, to my mind, was a little more difficult to parse. I don't have alternate wording in front of me, but I don't know if that, what I'm going on about sort of makes sense, but I'm proposing that the wording be lightened or rewritten so that so on the one hand, we can see which groups of folks are stopped most of all, and on the other hand, within a racial, by racial ethnic group, where was a basis for a stop more likely? Which basis was more likely? I'm not sure if I said that I didn't say that in a very direct way, but are there questions about what I'm trying to convey there, or from anyone at DOJ or else?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think I understand that this is maybe a denominator issue, maybe.
Yeah,
or kind of the way that the denominator is kind of phrased.
So one is how do you want to break up? What do you want the denominators to be? But then the other is then how do you want to word it? And I don't want folks to get the takeaway that if in fact, for example, Black cyclists are stopped of all stops, all cyclist stops, much more than any other group, that somehow they're now labeled as least frequently stopped. So it's here by basis of stop.
Yeah, and I also see that Member Smith has his hand raised.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Board Member Smith, did you want to go ahead? Let's see if we can get you back. Oh, great. I think you're still muted, but
Yeah, I was
thank
raising my hand in regards to another topic
you. Okay.
related to calls for service. So I don't want to inadvertently cabin this discussion about your point, Lily. So
Please go
please
ahead.
feel free to proceed. Okay,
So
all right. So I'm thinking about the calls for service. The data is helpful, and I just want to point out like a policy argument that we could potentially add, Garrett. So generally in the landscape, when it comes to calls for service, there's been growing momentum to think about alternative responses to a lot of calls for service that law enforcement agencies are responsible for responding to. Many localities throughout the state have built out alternative response systems for a variety of situations. So, for example, people experiencing behavioral or mental health issues, alternative response for people who are unhoused, alternative response for people that are dealing with substance use issues. And research shows that these new programs are far more effective than having a law enforcement officer with a gun respond to the situation. It's not uncommon for the traditional response to go astray, lead to trauma, dehumanization, and all too often police violence when someone's in crisis or just needs help. So thinking about this topic, I just want to uplift that as a potential recommendation to, I think it's a natural, when we talk about calls for service, it's a natural through line, I think that we can make. And even law enforcement is on point with this perspective in a lot of jurisdictions throughout the state. So for example, a few years ago, the Los Angeles Police Protective League, which is the rank and file entity for the Union for Rank and File Law Enforcement in LAPD. They issued a letter outlining recommendations to divert over 20 something calls for services away from police department as a primary responder. So it's not just, just to kind of double down on it, it's not just like maybe like nonprofit organizations or like policy experts that think this, but it's also law enforcement voices that are in agreement. And one of the things that they often say that if they're not well trained or suited to deal with every social issue that they're responsible for, right? The scope of their responsibilities has expanded significantly over time. So they're not only responsible for serious crimes, but a whole host of things that are better dealt with through more solution-oriented programs as opposed to like criminalization or like punishment-centered approaches. So I'm just sharing that idea as something for us to add a little bit more context to the data on calls for service.
Thank you so much. Can I just add to that? Many, many years ago, the RIPA board had, we had some experts come in and describe what they were doing in communities. I think in particular in San Francisco, and then in a much smaller municipality where a social worker was assigned with the police, depending on what kind of calls came in, might actually be the one to go out, or sometimes go out with an officer. And even though that was only set up, it was only like a 9 to 5 coverage, that still was a huge step forward. So it's a concrete example, exactly what you're describing.
And if it was already a recommendation, we could revisit it, I guess, like refer back to it since it's something that's evolving over time and is rapidly expanding, not only in California, but throughout the nation. So perhaps a brief update on like, hey, we said this before, there's been some momentum and it continues to be a successful pathway forward for addressing racial profiling as well as the underlying issues that actually could give rise to the stops, right? Mm-hmm. So something like that.
Yeah, and I don't remember offhand in the moment what that year's report included recommendation wise, but I do remember it was a chance for the board to learn from different communities. So maybe at a minimum here, a chance to list if there are law enforcement agencies in California that we can find out are doing something like this, or to see if I'd really like us to elevate it if it wasn't before to a recommendation. Thank you for raising that. Are there other board members? Board Member Dobart, I apologize. Did you have your hand up earlier? If I missed it, if I'm making that up, you could say no. But had you wanted to?
No, you didn't. You didn't miss it. I did have it raised, and it was just to ask if the point you were making. I know you pointed to page 33 as an example about denominators and the way we're talking about this. It's really a question of whether or not you feel your point also applies to, I mean, the same topic, but on page 6, so earlier. And I just want to make sure that didn't get lost. If it applies, then making sure that doesn't get lost.
Yeah, thank you. So emphasizing that when we look at, for example, calls for service and that the way that the data is reported out and broken down, is that there's a clarity to the description. Yeah, thank you. Are there other comments about the draft in particular? We didn't talk about the breakout boxes, the text boxes, and I wanted to say just generally, I am a fan of them. I think it's a great idea. It makes the report a little easier to digest also visually. I wasn't sure, Garrett, if you were asking about particular terms, and that's something the board could be thinking about as we have later drafts too.
Yeah, I mean, either particular ideas right now or just general direction, either of those. And it's, the general direction that they're good is a good general direction. So, so yeah.
I have a question independent of the draft. So I'll just put it out there while others are thinking about additional comments they want to share, which is, I'm wondering if there's an update about the data dashboard. Even if the update is that it's in the works, but I am curious if there are any new timelines, updates, any update at all. Daniel, I saw you pop in.
It's me, Daniel, again. Yeah, the dashboard is moving along. We have moved to the next phase of executive review. It's going through the process for usability and integration, all of that stuff. So it is on track for that late summer release, and we will keep you updated.
Okay, so I heard in progress, movement forward, but also late summer release. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Are there other comments about the draft in particular? And then if not, I'd like to move to an extremely important part of our meeting, which is the public comment. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So what I'd like to do is invite members of the public who'd like to share comments to, if possible, to see if you can toggle a raise your hand feature. I'm going to see if I'm able to view that. And also, I want to echo at a previous meeting, Board Member Dobard reminded me to share that comment can also be sent directly to DOJ through the email address. And I'll just say it out loud so it's here on the tape, but it's AB953, so the letters A and B and then 9 and 5 and 3 at doj.ca.gov. And in general, comments that are sent there then can be shared with the board as a whole. Usually we do public comment from north to south, but today, in a dramatic change of pace, let's start with Southern California. And so, Michelle Wittig, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to share a comment? Knowing also the board, we take this in. I really appreciate public comment. We don't necessarily respond in real time, but this becomes part of the record.
Great. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I have 3 brief comments. which I actually put in the chat, but I'd like to get them on the recording as well. The first one has to do with outcomes of pretext stop reform. The second one has to do with benchmarks. And the third, supporting law enforcement agencies' production of useful local reports. So with respect to the first one, in the chat, I put the link to an article that recently appeared entitled Curbing Pretextual Stops, Police Efficiency and Racial Disparities in the Journal of Public Economics. The paper analyzed several measures of the impact of pretextual stop reform in the Los Angeles Police Department, which occurred in 2022. Results showed that the policy led to, one, a significant reduction in minor violation stops, with similar reductions across all racial groups. Second, there were higher arrest rates conditional on a stop following the policy. And third, there was a decrease in minor violation stops, but it did not lead to increases in crime rates. So in brief, the policy appears to have resulted in fewer minor violation stops, but a higher percentage of those stops resulted in arrests. This suggests that with respect to arrests, at least, after the reform, minor violation stops were more productive, more efficient, and more effective for all racial groups. Okay, the second point has to do with benchmarks. Some urban police departments discount the benchmarks used in RIPA data reports. They criticize the use of U.S. Census population for benchmarking. They claim that a substantial percentage of stops and searches are made on homeless individuals who are, they say, not included in census data. However, the U.S. Census claims that their statistics make an effort to include the homeless. Could the board address this common criticism and respond to it? The third suggestion, support local law enforcement agencies' production of useful and informative local reports. The board could provide a template of essential graphs and tables to local law enforcement agencies as a guide to minimal standards for local reporting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there other Californians, any members of the public here? So I said we moved from south to north, but I'm going to open it up. If there's anyone from the public, if you're able to toggle the hand raising feature. And I don't see anyone at this time. And if you're not able to, but are able to unmute, can I invite you to go ahead if there's a member of the public who'd like to make comment? Okay, at this point, I don't see additional members of the public who want to make comment. I'll reiterate that their email can also be sent to DOJ at ab953 at, and then doj.ca.gov to share additional comment with the board. And so then moving on, we're at the last portion of our meeting where we're discussing next steps. Can I ask DOJ, I believe we have a full board meeting just around the corner. If anyone would like to remind us of the date here. And then can I also open to the board? We've shared comments today about the draft, but I'm wondering if there are additional next steps that anyone wants to share. Garrett, I see you came on. Did you want to share the date or anything?
Yeah, as a reminder, the full board meeting is next week, Friday the 17th at 9 a.m.
Great. Board Member Dobar, thank you, Garrett.
I was going to ask this, then I thought I didn't need to, but it's a clarifying question. Were we told earlier that for the full board meeting, we would get an updated version that includes the analysis, the longitudinal analysis, or the 4-year comparison? Did DOJ say that we would have?
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
And then I'm speaking for research services, but I believe that they discussed that their presentation might include more information on that. The presentation that's made.
Oh, the presentation. So
yeah.
Okay. So the presentation.
But Dan's coming on.
Board meeting.
Daniel's coming on now, so he can explain better than I can.
Hi. Yes, Daniel Arman here. Yes, for the full board meeting, we are going to focus a bit more on the emphasis for this year's report, which is the longitudinal analyses or the longitudinal perspective.
Okay, in the presentation though, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, got it. Thank you.
So it sounds like by and large, the drafts that we've received so far, the one we received for the stop data, I know there's a policies draft out there, and I think a post draft, and maybe those were already actually sent out for the general board meeting. But it sounds like I'm hearing those drafts are pretty much in the state they'll be at going into the meeting. But meanwhile, we'll hear some more in the presentation. Thank you, Board Member Dar, for raising that. And that will also be helpful for us if we're trying to think about ways for the report to have, some coherence as a whole through the themes. And then especially the longitudinal analysis, looking at departments where policy changes have been effective or not. That's extremely helpful. That's a key part of this year's report that's coming. Are there other comments about next steps? Besides our next step of the board meeting? Board Member Guerrero, were you starting to say something? Oh, I apologize. I saw my screen flicker. Does anyone else want to weigh in at this time with suggestions? There were a host of suggestions throughout our meeting today. I think they were really rich. I really appreciate the discussion that came out of this meeting. Anything else that someone wants to suggest for our next steps as a subcommittee? All right, we've had such a good discussion. There are no additional next steps, it looks like. All right, well, I want to thank everyone. I really appreciate the discussions that came up. Thank you for the public comment. I haven't quite kept up with the chat, but I'm going to circle back to it. I always appreciate comments that are there as well. And I guess I'm looking for someone, if anyone wants to suggest, if we think we're on track to adjourn. I'm open to that. Yes, I see some nodding. All right. And I think we're there. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again. Important work. And I look forward to seeing everyone next week at the full board meeting. Thank you again.